Hi, my name is Ben Craig, and tonight I want to tell you the story of Dirk and what Dirk had to say about death. So Dirk Willems was a very ordinary young man in the Netherlands, lived in the 1500s. Unfortunately, Netherlands was very different than the reality that we live in the United States today. And what was different was that the ruling authorities at the time had a very, very particular view of what it meant to be a Christian and to be a citizen of their country. And so this box that they created that you had to fit in, if you didn't fit in that box, you were in prison and possibly even dead. So this is just a social reality that Dirk knew. And yet as a young man, his faith growing within him, and he's realizing this is what it means to follow Jesus. Eventually, that growth took him outside of that box, and Dirk landed in prison. Well, he's a young man, he's innovative, in prison. What else is Dirk supposed to do? So pretty soon he found himself starting a rag collection. Of course, this isn't just like any ordinary rag collection. Dirk happens to be making a rope out of these rags, but that's his business, not necessarily anybody else's. So with his newfound hobby of making a rope out of rags, Dirk is just awaiting the day when finally he's gonna take that rope, stick it outside the window, crawl down the side of his prison, which was a former castle, been converted into a prison, race across the frozen moat, and on his way to freedom again. Freedom finally to again live a normal life. Freedom to practice his faith as he best understood it. So finally, 1569, that day came. Dirk, seen his opportunity, with excitement within him, all the hope of everything he'd ever wanted in all those days, sitting in the cold cell, mingled with the fear. If this doesn't work out, it's not just that I'm probably going back to that cell. If this doesn't work out, I'm probably a dead man. It was a high stakes test, and yet Dirk said it's worth it. Putting the rope down the side of the wall, crawling down, racing across the moat, Dirk was out of there. Well, sort of. He wasn't alone. Of course, a prison guard saw him, so pretty soon as Dirk is racing across the field, he hears footsteps behind him and realizes he's not alone. He's being chased. And what's at stake is not just, will he get free or not? Really what's at stake is he going to live? If he gets recaptured, he's probably dead. So really the only other option is to outrun this man. So Dirk races across the field. Pretty soon there comes a pond. Now it had been cold recently, but not that cold. So Dirk sees, okay, the ice is thin, but what other choice does he have? He's a light man, so he races across the thin ice and makes it to the other side. And so scrambling up on the bank, he's again running on solid ground, and all of a sudden he hears, "Help!" And he stops and turns around and looks, and it's the worst case scenario. It's the moral dilemma that you hope you never have to be in. So what Dirk saw when he turned around was the guard that had been chasing him had fallen through that thin ice. And if that wasn't bad enough, there was only one person in the world that could save that guard from drowning. And that man was Dirk Willems. So here Dirk faces what seems to be an impossible decision. Before him lies freedom. If he just continues to running, he's almost certain to be free. He can hide, eventually get away, and hardly anybody would blame him. It would seem to be a perfectly understandable position. And yet the very reason he had been put into prison was his desire to follow Jesus without reservation. And this Jesus had said, love your enemies. And so Dirk was torn. In a split second, it wasn't just a gut decision he had to make. This decision had to come from the depths of his heart. And he was torn between to run forward and to leave the man behind to drown. Dirk would save his life, but he would lose his true life. And so in that moment, Dirk turned back. Reaching across the thin ice, he stretched out, grabbed onto the drowning man, and pulled him to safety. The guard, as you can probably expect, being grateful, intended to let Dirk go. But the mayor yelled out, "Don't let that man go. Remember your oath." So Dirk was again captured, taken back to his cell, and by May of that year, he was tried as a heretic, found guilty, and was burned at the stake. And the day of of his execution, there was a wind that blew the flames away from his body so that it took longer than usual, and 70 times he cried out in pain before he finally was dead. So we look at the story of Dirk and we say, why did Dirk do it? Why did he turn back? Should Dirk have turned back? Is this world really a better place when people like Dirk Willems choose to be killed rather than to kill? And the answer to that question, said Marcus, our tour guide, is yes. You see, we were actually at a museum in the Amish country in Ohio this January, our family, my wife and our 4 young children. And we had just wrapped up a tour. The museum is called the Behalt. And so it's a mural of paintings, and it's actually a cyclorama. There's only 4 of them in the United States. It goes all the way around you, 360 degrees. It's 265 feet long, painting after painting, telling story after story of the faith of this people group called the Anabaptists that for 500 years had held a peace tradition that said they would rather be killed than to kill. And so Marcus went on to say that actually the painter of this mural was not an Anabaptist himself. And yet the painter had said, you know, you're not going to have time to tell visitors all the stories that are here. But I want you to always make sure the stories that you do tell, make sure you always tell the story of Dirk Willems. And so Marcus, our tour guide, went on. He said, you know, one day there was a group I was taking through, and at the end of the tour, there was a young lady that found herself back at the painting of Dirk Willems. And it wasn't just that she was touched by it, she was sobbing. And so Marcus said, well, I asked my fellow employee, like, hey, does anybody know this young lady? Kind of what's going on here? And so they soon learned the story. So this young lady had been a victim. As a young girl, she was a victim in the Nickel Mines Amish school shooting. She'd gone to school that day. It was an ordinary day. Teacher had been there, a number of students, some parents. And before long, a young man had barged in, and he was a familiar man. He had been the driver of the milk truck, and a number of the students would have known him. And he barged into the school that day and took captive over a dozen young Amish girls. The teacher, a number of the students, and the parents were able to flee, but the girls that were kept captive were there, and before it was all ended, he had killed 5 of them. 5 more were wounded, and the rest traumatized. And this girl was one of the ones that had been wounded. To this day, she still has the scars in her body from the bullet wounds from that day. And so this girl went on. She said, you know, that day, in the aftermath of that day, my father gathered our family together that evening, and we were shattered. And how can you process this? And she said, my dad gathered our family together that day, that evening. My sister had been killed. I had been wounded. I'd been to the hospital. And what my dad wanted to share with us that evening was this. He says, we're going to reach out to the wife of the killer. We're going to tell her that we love her. And we want her to know that she's forgiven and that she doesn't have to bear what her husband did. And to explain the nature of this radical love to us, this young lady said, my dad told us the story of Dirk Willems.